While playing a game, you know that feeling when there are so many things going on and you just can't seem to keep up? Maybe you're being attacked at 3 different places, or maybe you just can't seem to keep town centers running while using your army. There are many instances where you can get overwhelmed and your brain just doesn't seem to be able to process all the information that it needs to solve all the problems happening at once. This can be frustrating because you know there are so many things you need to get done, but you can't seem to do anything. As soon as you solve one problem, 2 more come up. There are 2 things you can do to prevent being overloaded like this. One is just to do things faster. With experience, you'll build muscle memory, which will allow you to perform actions quickly and without using as many mental resources. This means you can do 1 or more things while thinking of something else. A basic example of this is scouting while keeping your town center producing in the early game. With some experience, you should be in the habit of periodically selecting your town center and queuing villagers without having to really think of it. Once queuing villagers and scouting becomes automatic, you can even read and interact with stream chat while playing. The second way to prevent being overloaded is in the title. Simplifying responses can be defined as reducing thoughts and actions into instructions that can be processed faster due to only considering what to do while in-game. If you take care of thinking how to do things, why you should do them, and when they should be done beforehand, you'll have an easier time when forced to make those decisions in-game. This kind of thinking will allow you to get more things done while thinking less. Of course, it only works if your simplified response is made up of well thought out parts. It's a lot easier to learn things right the first time than to go back and relearn them. But something can be said for doing things wrong for the sake of truly understanding why it's wrong. Knowing how to do things is just as important as knowing how not to do things. Let's start with a simple example: building a house. Building a house may seem like only one action, but it's actually multiple. There are 2 ways to build a house. You can either click through the menus or use hotkeys to get through them. Whichever way you do it, it's actually 4 actions which you think of as only one. In this instance, the only reason you'd use the clicking method is due to the hotkey method being slightly more difficult to learn. That, or you're playing without a keyboard. Let's look at a more complex example to really demonstrate the value of simplifying responses. The opponent has crossbowmen that just showed up behind your wood line. What's your response? It can't be, what? Since you'll lose villagers the longer you wait. You should have considered the Civ matchup and come up with a solution earlier while scouting the map in Dark Age. If your opponent is Ethiopians and you're Burmese, you know that there's a good chance he'll have crossbowmen behind your wood lines at some point, especially if he's up to Castle Age faster than you. Your skirmishers lack the second armor upgrade, so they're no good. You could go for knights or siege, or maybe a combination of the 2. Or maybe you want to build a tower and then stay on stone for a rambai later. Now here's the simplified response for this. Step 1. Pull villagers away and send to straggler trees away from the threat. Step 2. Look at your minimap to see if he's attacking multiple places at once. Step 3. Quickly consider your 3 options for dealing with the crossbowmen. And step 4, once the threat is gone, return the villagers back to work. The most complicated part here is step 3, where you have to consider how much resources you want to invest into pushing the crossbowmen back. The most investment is knights, where you have to have +2 armor and enough army size to actually take on the crossbowmen. The advantage of knights is that you can actually counterattack afterwards. The middle investment is a defensive siege workshop for mangonels or scorpions. This pretty much guarantees that you'll push the crossbowmen away, but you won't be able to put much pressure on your opponent since siege moves slowly and you're producing them from your base. And the lowest investment of resources from you is just to wait until the crossbowmen leave the area and then build a tower on the wood line. When responding to pressure from the opponent, you have to be able to make the right decisions on how many resources to invest into your response. Instead of asking what should I do to defend this, the question should be how much should I invest into defending this? One person's defend against crossbowmen at the woodline might be different than another person's. Even though the action to check the minimap for multiple actions is not required, it still makes sense to include as part of the response since it's common to be attacked from multiple places at once. The point of thinking about this all ahead of time is so that you can just do the defend against crossbowmen at your woodline response and do all this without thinking too much. This might allow you to defend against crossbowmen at your woodline while attacking the opponent on the front while expanding to a neutral gold mine on the map while taking relics. You'll see pros be able to do this all at the same time because they don't actively think of every action they perform. They just use simplified instructions that they already thought of from experience. You don't need to do such complicated responses to start. A lot of the time, even associating two actions can make your gameplay a lot stronger. For example, when reaching Feudal and Castle Age, get the wood upgrade. In most games, you should get the wood upgrades as soon as you reach the next age, so it is useful to get into the habit of associating reaching the next age with getting it. You'll get to the point where this is automatic. Every time you reach the next age, you get the wood upgrade. But wait, there are multiple ways of getting the wood upgrade. You can navigate to your lumber camp and then click the wood upgrade. Or you can use a hotkey to go to the lumber camp and then a hotkey to research the technology. This shows that even if you're doing exactly what you need to do, it might not be the best way of doing it. It's worth making sure that you're doing things in an efficient way when you're trying to improve at the game. It's not enough to just do the right things. You have to do the right things in the right way. I'm going to go through some various simplified responses that I've thought of, along with some explanations for how to do some of the individual actions that make up the responses. This won't cover every single action that you can make in the game, but hopefully there will be at least one that you haven't thought of. Before we get into the details, I just want to mention that the more experience you have, the more information you can take into account when deciding what to do. You can go from knowing what to do when seeing crossbowmen, to knowing what to do when seeing crossbowmen with bodkin arrow, versus crossbowmen with just fletching. The more information that you can actually use, the more specific your responses can be. Alright, let's finally get to the examples, starting with one we're all familiar with. When you get housed, immediately get a villager to build a house, cancel all villagers that are being built, then queue up Loom, Town Watch, or Wheelbarrow. This will keep your town center working, which is pretty much always a good thing. Luckily, Town Watch and Loom both take 25 seconds to research, which also happens to be the time it takes to build a villager, or a house, with one builder. For Wheelbarrow, it takes 75 seconds, so if you're not quite ready to commit 3 villagers worth of TC work time into it, it's best to rush up your house with multiple villagers, and just eat the idle time. With 4 villagers, building times are halved, so the house only takes 12.5 seconds. This rule applies to all buildings. Here's a quick demonstration of when you might want multiple villagers building something. You can see that having more villagers building builds the buildings faster, but it reduces efficiency. If you don't need a building quickly, it's best to just construct it with 1 villager. Let's get back to when you'd get Wheelbarrow. It increases villager carry capacity by 3 and movement speed by 10%. This makes villagers bring in more resources since it reduces the travel time to drop off what they've collected. For most resources, there will be a drop-off point within a few tiles where the villager is gathering. The more your villagers have to walk to drop off resources, the more they'll benefit from Wheelbarrow. The one resource that always requires a lot of walking no matter what is food collected from farms. Farmers always walk around the farm while collecting from it, so they benefit a lot from Wheelbarrow. When to get Wheelbarrow is therefore usually based on how many farmers you have. I find that I usually like to get Wheelbarrow just before clicking up to Castle Age, but it really depends on the strategy and the civilization that you are. If you don't have Town Watch, you'll almost always want to get it instead of idling the TC, since it's pretty inexpensive and it will likely allow you to react faster to enemy attacks, which could save villagers collecting resources from dangerous places. Once you've dealt with starting an upgrade, it's worth it to go back to your house builders and queue them back to the resource they were on. And there you go, that's the thought process for how to respond when getting housed in Dark or Feudal Age. I hope this detailed analysis is interesting because there's a ton more to go through. Next up is what to do when a farm expires. You might be in the habit of always reseeding it, but this can be very bad. For example, when you build something like 15 farms when making archers in order to get up to Castle Age. There's a pretty good chance some of your farms will be expiring on the way up, so you should decide whether you actually need more food income or if it's better to increase your wood or gold income. If you're going crossbowman, you only really need enough food for a crossbowman upgrade, bodkin arrow, and around 6 farmers to collect enough food to keep your 1 TC running. So, in this case, as long as you have around 6 villagers collecting food, the farmers whose farms expired can go to another resource. If you arrive to Castle Age with a ton of food and no wood while you're trying to go 3 TC or crossbowman, you'll start to fall behind since you can't spend your excess food. In the late game, there are so many better uses of your focus than to reseed farms, so it's worth it to enable auto reseed at some point. Once you can't keep track of your economy, this is the time to click auto reseed. If you have multiple farms expire at the same time, you can press the idle villager button to center your view on a villager and then right click to reseed the farm. If you press the idle villager button without moving the mouse, you can just right click to reseed since the cursor is already in the correct position. This is the fastest way to reseed multiple farms at once. Here are just a few strategic considerations that you can take into account when deciding whether you should reseed a farm. This is in the context of around late feudal age to around early to mid castle age. If going crossbowman, only reseed if you don't have enough farms to keep villagers producing. If going 3 TC boom, make sure you have enough wood for TCs right when you arrive to castle age. If you don't need the food right away, maybe save up for horse collar or heavy plow before reseeding. If you're going knights, you'll usually want to reseed unless you're already floating a lot of food. Make sure you have enough stables to spend your food. To keep knights producing, you need around 6 on farms. For constant villager production, you also need 6, so if you have 12 on food, you have enough to keep 1 TC and 1 stable running. It's good to have extra food for upgrades, so having 2 or 3 more than you need for units will allow you to build up extra food to afford them. Alright, moving on to when to get a new production facility. When you think it's time to get a new production facility, make sure that you have the economy to support it. Not only do you need enough resources to afford the building, you also need the income to be able to build the units that you want from it. For town centers, you'll want to maintain villager production always, so it's best to plan to have the town center finish around the same time as when you've built the 6 farms required to keep it running. This can mean building 3 farms before starting the town center and then 3 after you've started construction. For military production, you need to think of if you just want a few units or constant production. If you're just going to build a few units, make sure you have enough floated resources to afford them. A common example of just wanting a few units is when getting 6 to 10 knights in Castle Age while adding town centers. The reason to add these knights is to clean up small groups of feudal units, take map control, and put pressure on the opponent. This can force him to overcommit to defense while you expand your economy and take an even bigger lead. If you had a short feudal age, you might only be able to afford 1 stable to produce knights from. Usually having 2 stables will give you a good balance between investment of resources and unit creation speed. 3 stables is useful if you want to go more all-in with a very fast attack, or you need them for defense. You might have to stop villager production and go really heavy on gold from when you click up to Castle Age to make 3 stable knights work. It's often better to just go for 2 stable knights with forward siege instead of 3 stable knights if you're going for an attack. You only have a limited number of resources to work with, so consider if you can actually afford the units you want out of the production facility before you build it. When building many of the same facility, you either have to have a good enough economy to support constant production, or be preparing for a fast attack. If you build a production facility and don't use it, you are probably better off building 3 farms instead. It's a similar idea to when you should get military upgrades. The upgrades don't do anything until you fight, so if you don't plan on fighting anytime soon, it's best to invest your resources elsewhere until you're almost ready to fight. If you're wanting to maintain constant production, you mainly have to make sure you have enough farmers and gold miners first. I did a whole video on this topic called Tying Strategy to Eco Management, so go watch that for more details. Once you've got your eco sorted out, consider if the unit that you want to build from this production facility will actually do what you need it to do. For town centers, only expand economy if you don't need the resources for military right away. Just because you can afford a production facility doesn't mean it's your best option. Instead of investing a ton of resources into elite skirmishers to deal with enemy crossbowmen, it's often better to just build a siege workshop and a few siege units while getting extra town centers and farms. Counter units such as pikemen, skirmishers, and camels are generally really good against what they counter, and really bad against most other things. If you go for a counter unit, you might find that you're the one getting countered once your opponent sees what you're building. Spending as little resources as necessary when defending is often one of the best ways to get ahead. When actually placing the building, you shouldn't just randomly place it. Buildings on the front can help strengthen the wall and reinforce armies faster, but they can be susceptible to being attacked and destroyed. If the opponent is pressuring you, get the building away from the enemy so he doesn't kill units one by one, and he won't destroy the building itself. Adding the building to a control group will allow you to set a rally point for certain buildings without including all of them. This can be especially helpful when you have stables around the map to raid, and you don't want to mess up their rally points while using the select all hotkey to queue units. So, real quickly, when deciding to get a production facility, check your resources and resource income to make sure that you can afford the unit. Consider if the unit that you want is the least expensive option to accomplish the same job. Make sure that the building placement is in a suitable location, and then add it to a control group. Following this logic will allow you to get military out while keeping your town centers running smoothly. Okay, now let's talk about some of the things that you can do when the opponent hits Castle Age first. Think of how close you are to Castle Age yourself. If you've started advancing, you can probably try to counter what your opponent does in early Castle Age. If you know he's going crossbowman, you can try to build up skirmisher numbers until you can fight him once you have castle age upgrades of your own. If he's going knights, you have to make sure your base is secured with walls, and prepare stables for camels if you can, or build up spearman numbers before researching pikemen once you get up. Of course, you can also rush up a monastery for monks once you actually reach castle age, but that takes a bit of time to do. Depending on how much your opponent commits to his aggression, you may need siege as well. You can also go for the opposite approach and continue to spam feudal age units. Sometimes you can make up for the lack of quality with quantity. I think you've realized it by now, but I'm barely scratching the surface on how the state of the game could be and what information you need to take into account in order to make good strategic decisions. This is why you'll often get the "it depends" answer on questions that involve reacting to what the opponent is doing. Anyways, my responses here are just a few from the hundreds or thousands that you can make. The point here is to have a plan for if the opponent gets to castle age first, so that you don't waste time thinking of one on the spot. Reacting fast here can save you sometimes, and even allow for a counterattack that can win the game for you. Here are just two examples of what you could do if the opponent hits castle age first. The first example is the defensive approach, and the second example is the more aggressive approach. First, pull your feudal army back behind your walls so you don't lose it. Then secure your base with walls and fortify the front. Get a market to buy yourself up to castle age if you haven't clicked up yet, and you're floating wood and gold. Then, think of what units to build versus what the opponent has and balance the economy for it. If you have any exposed villagers collecting resources on the front, move them to the back so they don't get picked off. Make sure to be patient and wait until you have enough units and upgrades before you attack. This can sometimes mean giving up ground in your base, but that's okay. Once you've cleaned up your opponent's army, you can always take that land back. The second example here is to continue making feudal army while adding more production facilities and try to take favorable engagements on the smaller mass of castle age units. You can get towers at home to defend key areas against crossbowmen. If your opponent has knights, you can try to keep an eye on them and pick off low numbers with scouts and spearmen. Secure your base with walls and try to click up to castle age while putting the pressure on your opponent. You need to try and keep your army alive and only take favorable fights here. You can't afford to lose your army mass. Since you're getting up to castle age later than your opponent, your early castle age economy should be ahead. This may allow you to go forward with castle age upgrades to do a counterattack. Trying to push the opponent in castle age without really knowing what you're doing can put you even further behind. So why don't we go over some ways to help with this? If you're using archers, you can put them on stand ground to prevent them from moving forward. If you're using mangonels, pull back if you're worried about enemy mangonels. It's still a good idea to split them even if you don't pull them back. This way enemy mangonels can't kill two of yours at once. The most important thing to do is to make sure that your units are in a control group. Once you have your units under control, then you can go back and do what you need to do in your base. This can be making farms, sending lumberjacks to gold, or maybe making production facilities. The most important thing to keep in mind is that you should be spending all of your wood here. Try to keep a mental note of where the opponent's army is. If he's not trying to push you away, he might be building up an army, or he's maybe going for a counterattack. Keeping track of this will help you to not get caught off guard. Take map control. This means taking relics and neutral resources and castling hills that might be strategically important. If your push is not going well, you can try attacking from another angle, or send small groups of units around to distract the opponent. Splitting your army is not always good, since it's a lot easier to take out two small groups of units instead of one large group. Sometimes it can really pay off though, like if you have two small groups of crossbowmen, you can range two wood lines. Anyways, let's not get too deep into the strategy here, and move on to the next section, what to do when losing a battle. Sometimes when you're attacking, you get forced into an unfavorable engagement, or you misjudge how you think the battle will go. You lose your entire army, and you need to quickly decide what to do next. In these cases, your opponent likely has at least half his army left, and will be on his way to your base shortly. There are many ways to react to this, and the only thing worse than having a bad reaction is no reaction at all. Depending on the individual game, these can be some of the steps that you take to successfully defend a counterattack. First, make sure your base is secured with walls. You might need an extra layer of walls to slow the opponent down. You should prioritize the side of your base that the enemy is likely going to attack first, and then determine if you need walls in other areas as well. Sometimes it becomes necessary to stop producing villagers in order to make an army strong enough to defend. Building villagers is an investment for later, so they're only useful if there actually is a later. If you can't defend them, then it can be better to go completely all in with your military. If you do manage to defend, then you can try to go for a counterattack of your own to attempt to equalize the villager counts. You have to decide whether to continue producing the same units that you were attacking with or produce counter units. The units that you were attacking with will have upgrades already, so even if they aren't the optimal unit to defend with, they might be your best option because you're already set up to build them. If the units you were attacking with simply won't work against what's coming to your base, you will need to switch to something else. First, you have to guess how much time you have until you have to fight the opponent's army. If you have a lot of time, you might be able to go for a more expensive but more effective counter. Countering crossbowmen with skirmishers and knights with pikemen require multiple production facilities and expensive upgrades in order to be effective. Sometimes you just don't have the time and resources to afford these units. That's where siege and monks come into play. These units don't require any upgrades to be effective. A big downside to defending with siege and monks is that they're slow moving, so going for a counterattack is tough. If you do decide to go for hard counter units such as skirmishers or pikemen, keep in mind that those units perform poorly against most units that they don't counter. They might get you through the first wave, but you have to be careful if the opponent adds a counter to your counter. Once you have enough army to defend, make sure to resume villager production if you think you can catch up in economy, or go for an all-in counterattack if you're too far behind. Losing a battle at your opponent's base means you have a chance to defend. Losing a battle at your own base often means losing the game. You have to really make sure you have enough army before engaging the enemy, especially when taking a fight at home. Patience is very important. Sometimes you just have to give up ground until you're ready. Knowing what to do after losing a battle is great and all, but what if you're in one of those rare situations where you actually win a battle? How do you press the advantage? Being able to snowball an advantage is why losing one villager early at high levels can lead to a one-sided defeat later on. There are many things that you can do after winning a battle, and it's worth going through the list mentally when you're in that situation. First, consider if you should go for a counterattack, or expand your economy further by adding more town centers and getting ecotechs that you don't have yet. If you want to go for a counterattack, you need to keep military production running, and maybe even add more production facilities. Getting a siege workshop on the front lines can really help here if you have walls that you need to get through. If you're close to clicking up to Imp, you can get a forward castle for Trebs and skip the siege workshop. Getting to Imp first while having a forward castle means you can more easily take out key buildings without the opponent being able to do anything. Be aware that if your opponent is up to Imp faster than you, he can easily Treb down your forward castle with his own Trebs, so you do have to be careful. Sometimes you don't want to commit to a full-scale counterattack after winning a fight. In this instance, use your remaining army to put pressure on your opponent while you take map control by building castles on key hills that protect neutral golden stones. This is also the perfect opportunity to collect relics if they're still on the map. If you take too long to decide what to do here, you won't be able to expand the advantage that you took from the fight. There's one more topic I wanted to go through here. What to do when floating wood in Imperial Age. If you're floating wood in the Imperial Age, there are a few things that you should consider before selling it at the market. First, make sure you have enough farms and production buildings. If you haven't added Hussar yet, then it's probably a good time to get 10 stables and like 20 more farms. You can use some of the wood to build extra production buildings closer to your opponent's base so you can raid more easily and reinforce your army faster. Sometimes dropping 4 siege workshops in the middle of the map to produce rams will give you what you need to actually finish the game. Once you've got farms and production sorted, quickly check the market prices. If you can get a good deal, sell a bunch of wood before your opponent can. If you're in the super late game, the gold on the map will start to dry up, so taking advantage of selling at the market before your opponent does can allow you to keep producing gold units while your opponent can only build trash. If there are any extra gold or stone mines left on the map, send entire wood lines worth of villagers to those. Since you're not spending wood, it means that you're spending the other resources, so it's best to try to take those resources, even if it's risky. You should try to get a castle at neutral gold mines on the map to protect your villagers, as they're usually very far from your main base where you can build army. You can even spend some of that wood that you've been hoarding on barracks near your neutral gold in case you need a few halberdiers to clean up enemy hussars that come in. Spending wood becomes progressively more difficult as the game goes on. Once you have all the farms you need, and all the production facilities you could ever ask for, it really is just better to sell it at the bottomed out price of 100 wood for 14 gold. If you're constantly floating thousands of wood, you might need to consider just genociding some of your extra villagers so that you can afford more army. And that does it for this one. By thinking of how you might deal with certain situations outside of the game, you can save time in-game, since you only have to think of what to do. By associating actions, you can string together multiple thoughts into one, allowing you to make faster and more consistent decisions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.